Imagine waking up next to someone who, just last night, swore they couldn't live without you, only to find a cold silence and a message that simply reads, "I need space." No explanation, no closure, just gone. That's what happened to Jacob, a talented photographer from Austin. Jacob had always been a master at capturing fleeting moments, sunsets over dusty highways, lovers laughing in golden light. But when it came to his own love life, every frame was either overexposed or heartbreakingly underdeveloped. He thought passion meant chaos. He thought love was supposed to be a beautiful mess, until the mess broke him. The morning after his last breakup, Jacob stared at his reflection in a rain-spattered window. He looked alive, but felt hollow. That day, something inside him snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. He didn't want to be at the mercy of someone else's confusion anymore. He didn't want to feel like he had to chase, convince, or perform for affection. That's when he found it, almost by accident, a quote from Epictetus: "We suffer, not from the events in our lives, but from our judgment about them." That line cut through the noise. It didn't just speak to him, it confronted him. What if love didn't have to feel like drowning? What if the real problem wasn't modern dating but his own mindset? So Jacob began an unexpected journey, not into dating advice forums or self-help books, but into Stoic philosophy, a 2,000-year-old worldview that felt eerily relevant. The more he read, the more the fog lifted. The Stoics didn't tell him how to win someone over. They taught him how to win himself back. He learned the principle of the dichotomy of control, that there are things we control, our thoughts, our actions, and things we don't, other people's feelings, the past, the outcome. He began practicing what he called emotional minimalism. He stopped trying to force conversations or decode every late-night message. When someone ghosted, he didn't spiral. He paused, he reflected, he reminded himself, "You are not entitled to someone else's presence, only your own integrity." One night, after a pleasant but ambiguous date with a woman named Mia, Jacob felt that familiar itch, the urge to overthink, to text, to ask, "Did I do something wrong?" But this time, he didn't. He put his phone down, stepped out onto his apartment balcony, and listened to the night. The city hummed with life, but inside, he felt still. That was new. Instead of overanalyzing Mia's silence, he turned inward. He grabbed his journal and wrote not about her, but about his own reactions. What was he afraid of? Rejection? Abandonment? Not being enough? Slowly, he started to see his patterns. He realized he had been dating not to connect, but to fill a void he hadn't dared to look into. As weeks passed, Jacob's life transformed. He wasn't playing it cool. He was genuinely calm. Not because he didn't care, but because he was no longer obsessed with controlling what couldn't be controlled. He became a better listener, a better observer, noticing things he'd always missed, the way someone's tone changed when they spoke about their past, the way their eyes darted when they felt uncertain, the way laughter sometimes masked longing. Dating stopped being a battlefield of egos and expectations. It became a field of awareness. Every encounter, every conversation was now a mirror, reflecting back to Jacob not just who the other person was, but who he was becoming. This isn't a story about getting the girl. It's not a seduction tactic or a game. This is about finding the strength to stay rooted in a world that's constantly trying to pull you off center. Jacob's story is only beginning, but his foundation is solid, and it's built on something ancient, powerful, and quietly revolutionary. Stoic mindfulness. If you've ever felt like you're losing yourself in the chaos of dating, like your worth is tied to someone else's attention, this story is for you. Stick around. You won't want to miss how this ends. If this story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more content that dives deeper into the philosophy and emotional intelligence behind modern relationships. But mini quiz time. Jacob chose peace over panic when Mia didn't respond right away. What do you think helped him the most in that moment? A. Trying to guess what she was thinking. B. Focusing on what he could control and letting go of the rest. Comment A or B below to let us know what you would do in that situation. Jacob was beginning to understand something he had never really paid attention to before. Words, though important, were often the least honest part of a conversation. It was their third date. He and Mia sat across from each other at a quiet rooftop bar in downtown Austin, the soft glow of the setting sun washing their faces in amber light. Jazz hummed in the background, but Jacob wasn't listening to the music. He was watching her, not in a way that intruded, but with a presence he'd never allowed himself to access before. Mia had a way of pulling inward for a split second. When something touched a nerve, most people wouldn't have noticed it. The faint pause before a smile, the flicker in her eyes that quickly vanished. But Jacob did. Ever since he embraced Stoicism, he had trained himself not just to react less, but to observe more fully, mindfully, like he was capturing a photo with his eyes. When he mentioned his childhood in a broken home, Mia responded with understanding words. "That must have been tough," she said. But her eyelids hesitated just briefly, like they had more to say than her mouth allowed. A subtle muscle in her cheek twitched, then vanished. It wasn't disdain, it wasn't pity. It was something else, recognition. Like she'd lived it too, but wasn't ready to say it. Before Stoicism, Jacob would have missed that. Or worse, he would have jumped in to fill the silence with nervous chatter, trying to make her comfortable. Now, he let the moment breathe. He allowed the silence to stretch between them without fear, trusting it could hold something true. That night, when he got home, he sat on his balcony and reflected, not on what she said, but how she had said it without words. He didn't need to decode her like a puzzle. He simply needed to be still enough to hear her without noise. Stoicism had sharpened his awareness. Through practices of reflection and mindful presence, he had learned that the truth often lives in the details, the way someone looks down when speaking about an ex, the way their hands fidget when they're unsure, the way a smile can linger, even after the laughter has stopped. With Mia, this deeper listening became a new kind of intimacy. It wasn't just about asking the right questions. It was about holding the space where answers didn't need to be forced. Jacob didn't push for confessions. He waited for trust to reveal them. The more time they spent together, the more he noticed how rarely people felt truly seen. Everyone was too distracted, checking their phones, preparing their replies, judging others based on first impressions. But Mia started to realize Jacob was different. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform. He simply saw her, fully and without an agenda. One evening, as they walked through Zilker Park, under a sky tinged with violet, Mia finally opened up. "You notice everything, don't you?" she said softly. "It's like I don't have to explain myself. You just get it." Jacob smiled, but said nothing. Not out of smugness, but reverence. He wasn't trying to be impressive. He was simply practicing the kind of attention he wished someone had given him years ago. To strengthen this ability, he had taken up a strange ritual, long exposure photography at dusk. He would set his camera on a slow shutter and capture the world in motion over time. It taught him patience. It trained him to see the transitions, the micro-shifts, the beauty that rushed eyes always missed. It became a metaphor for how he was learning to observe Mia, not to capture her, but to witness her fully. It wasn't about being stoic in the way most people misunderstood the word, motionless, detached. Quite the opposite. It was about being so present that emotions could rise and fall without being distorted or manipulated. Jacob learned that real presence is the most generous form of love, and slowly, Mia responded. Her body language softened. Her laugh became freer. She didn't say, "I trust you," but her eyes did. Her pauses didn't feel like retreats anymore. They were invitations. Moments where her guard lowered just enough for something real to pass through. Jacob wasn't searching for clues or playing detective. He was simply showing up clear, steady, and listening with everything he had. That's the paradox. When you stop trying to read someone, you start understanding them. When you let go of needing a reaction, you begin to receive something deeper, truth in its most human form. And in those microseconds where her smile faltered or her eyes said more than she could, Jacob didn't just learn about Mia, he learned about himself, his need for control, his fear of silence, his longing to be enough. But now, he was enough, because he was present, and sometimes, that's the only cue that really matters. There was no fight, no sharp words, no dramatic exit, just a slow drift like the tide pulling back from the shore. Jacob felt it before he could name it. Mia's responses came slower, her laughter softer, her presence more distant. It was the kind of shift you only notice if you're paying close attention, not to the noise, but to the quiet that settles in between. For most of his life, silence had been something Jacob feared. He used to fill every pause with jokes, reassurance, or anxious questions. But now, with Stoicism as his guide, he saw silence not as a threat, but as a message, and Mia was speaking in it. He remembered sitting across from her at a cafe one gray afternoon. Her hands were wrapped around her mug, eyes fixed on the swirling foam. She smiled, nodded at his words, even laughed once, but her focus was somewhere else. It wasn't rude. It wasn't cold. It was quieter than that, like a door had closed halfway between them. The old Jacob would have leaned in, tried harder, asked what was wrong, begged her to stay close. But this Jacob had changed. He had come to understand what the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the art of imagining loss, not to create fear, but to build resilience. He knew connection was fragile. He knew that people, even the ones we feel closest to, often carry wounds we can't fix, so he didn't panic. He didn't text her 3 times in a row, or replay the moment 1,000 different ways in his mind. Instead, he wrote. He sat with his own discomfort and journaled the feeling, not to analyze her, but to understand himself. What he found on those pages surprised him. He wasn't afraid of losing Mia. He was afraid of not being enough to keep her. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of his own insecurity, his fear of abandonment, his old belief that love must be earned through effort and performance. He recognized those thoughts and let them pass. He chose not to chase, not to fix. He chose stillness. 2 days passed that, then came her message. Hey, sorry I've been distant. My dad's sick. I flew back to San Francisco. I just didn't know how to talk about it. Jacob stared at the screen for a long moment. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was proud of who he'd become. The man who used to demand clarity had made room for silence, and in that space, trust had grown. He responded with one line, "I'm here when you're ready. No pressure." That night, he took another walk, something he had come to love during quiet moments. As he wandered along the moonlit path at Lady Bird Lake, he thought about all the times people had pulled away from him in the past and how he had always blamed himself, always tried to repair something that wasn't his to fix. But this was different. Now, he could tell the difference between personal rejection and personal responsibility. Not every silence is about you. Sometimes, it's just someone else's pain trying to breathe. Jacob had also developed a practice he called emotional mapping. After every meaningful interaction, he would reflect. What did I feel? Why did I react that way? What story am I telling myself? It became a map of his internal world, one that helped him navigate others with more grace and empathy. The next time he and Mia met, she looked tired but grateful. They sat on a bench overlooking the water. She told him everything about her father, her fear, her guilt. He didn't try to rescue her. He just listened. No solutions, no interruptions, just presence. And that's what amazed her most. "You didn't push me," she said quietly. "You let me come back on my own." That means more than I can explain." Jacob smiled, because now he knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to step back and hold space for someone to leave, and if they choose to return. He had learned that silence doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it's just a pause before a deeper kind of connection. And in that pause, in that breath between words, Jacob had become a man who no longer feared the quiet, but welcomed it. Because in silence, we often hear what matters most. Jacob had always thought questions were tools to get somewhere. Answers, validation, control. In the past, he'd fired off rapid inquiries on dates like a job interview, each one quietly masked in fear. Will you like me? Am I good enough? Are you going to hurt me? But that was before. Before he stopped needing to know everything. Before he stopped asking with his ego and started asking with his presence. Now, Jacob understood that the right question wasn't about control. It was about connection, and it didn't demand, it invited. One crisp evening, he and Mia found themselves at a little Mediterranean spot near the San Francisco marina. They'd both flown in separately that week, Mia to check in on her dad, Jacob to clear his mind. They hadn't planned to meet here, it just happened. And maybe that's what made it feel honest. There was a moment after the meal, wine glasses half empty, candlelight flickering between them, when the conversation reached that edge. Not small talk, not logistics, something else. The kind of moment where people usually panic and reach for their phones. But Jacob leaned in, not physically, but emotionally. With a soft voice, he asked, "What's something you rarely share? Because you're used to people not listening long enough to hear it." Mia looked at him like he had just asked her something she didn't know. She'd been waiting her whole life to be asked. She exhaled slowly. "I don't trust people who need me to be perfect. I've spent most of my life managing everyone's expectations. I get scared when someone sees me and still stays." Jacob didn't move, didn't try to fix it. He held her gaze and let the silence do its work. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was sacred. That moment wasn't about uncovering a secret. It was about creating the safety for truth to come up on its own. And Jacob had only learned to do that once he stopped trying to steer every conversation toward certainty. Instead of seeking answers that fed his insecurity, he started asking questions born out of genuine curiosity, not to prove anything, but to understand. He realized most people listen to reply, not to receive, and he didn't want to be most people anymore. To deepen this awareness, Jacob had embraced a simple but radical habit. Before asking anything, he'd pause and ask himself why. Was he asking to soothe his anxiety, to fill space? Or was he truly interested in what the other person might reveal? This shift changed everything. He stopped asking if she was okay every time she seemed quiet. He stopped asking where she saw the relationship going. Not because he didn't care, but because he trusted that clarity would come when the soil was ready. His questions became seeds, not demands. In one of their most vulnerable moments, Jacob invited Mia to share a meal in silence, a ritual inspired by something he'd read in a Stoic essay about presence. At first it felt strange. No talking, just eating, observing, being. But slowly, the quiet became comforting. Mia relaxed. Jacob noticed her in new ways, the way her fingers curled around the glass, the way her eyes moved when she thought. Afterward, Mia said, "It was one of the most intimate experiences of her life. I didn't feel like I had to perform," she said. "You weren't waiting for a punchline. You were just there." And that's what Jacob had come to understand through the Stoic path. Curiosity, when unshackled from outcome, becomes a form of love. It's the kind that asks, not because it needs something, but because it sees something worthy of attention. He no longer needed to know everything. He didn't need to hear "I love you" to feel connected. He didn't need answers to believe in the moment. Because when you stop interrogating love, you start experiencing it. And that's what made Mia stay. Not because she was convinced, but because she was seen without judgment, without pressure, without a timeline. Jacob's questions had once been weapons of control. Now, they were bridges of grace, and in the space between the asking and the answering, something real was allowed to breathe. There was something about Santorini that felt like it had been designed for longing. The way the sun sank into the Aegean Sea, like a secret being whispered to the earth. The way the breeze carried both warmth and ache. Jacob stood on the cliffside, camera hanging at his side, and watched Mia laugh with a group of strangers they'd just met at a wine tasting. Her joy was effortless, and in that moment, so far out of his reach, desire rose in him like a tide swift, electric, and familiar. But it didn't sweep him away like it used to. Because now, Jacob understood desire through a different lens. He had spent months learning the practice of apatheia, not the suppression of emotion, but the mastery of it. Stoicism had taught him that attraction was natural, even beautiful, but obsession was a prison we build for ourselves. And so, as Mia threw her head back in laughter and caught his eye from across the terrace, Jacob did something radical. He simply smiled and let the moment pass through him. There was a time when he would have clung to a trust over, claimed her attention, marked his presence, not out of malice, but fear. Fear of being forgotten, replaced, left behind. But this Jacob had stopped defining his worth by proximity or possession. He didn't need to own her attention to feel whole. Later that evening, they walked together along the cobbled paths above the caldera. The sky had deepened to a bruised purple, stars beginning to wake. Mia reached for his hand, and Jacob felt the warmth of it, but not the weight. He was present, yes, but not consumed. That was the difference. Inside the hotel, as they shared a quiet dinner on the balcony, he found himself overwhelmed by how much he felt and how peaceful it all was. He loved the way she asked questions with her eyes, how her voice softened when she talked about her dreams. And yet, he knew she could leave. This could end. It would hurt, but it wouldn't undo him. That's what Stoicism had gifted him, the strength to hold beauty without clutching it, to feel deeply without being ruled by it. In moments of high emotion, he had trained himself to pause and practice negative visualization. He would briefly imagine the loss of the very thing he cherished, not as a punishment, but as a way to sharpen his gratitude. So he imagined Santorini without Mia. He imagined the empty chair across the table, a quiet dot, and then, with that imagined loss in mind, he turned back to her, not to hold on tighter, but to love more freely. Desire no longer made him restless. It made him intentional. He had stopped turning passion into pressure, stopped translating excitement into expectation. Now, he let the moments breathe on their own. Mia noticed. "You feel different here," she said one morning as they walked along the beach. "Like you're not trying to make anything happen. You're just here. It makes me feel safe." Jacob looked at her, the sea crashing softly behind her. He nodded. "I used to chase what I feared I couldn't keep. Now, I just show up for what's real." He didn't say it as a performance. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was living it. That night they watched the stars from a rooftop with no music, no plans, no future talk. Just quiet breaths, side by side. And in that stillness, Jacob felt something stronger than control. He felt connection, not because he needed her to stay, but because he was grateful she had chosen to, freely. Attraction had become something sacred, not a hunger to be satisfied, but an energy to be honored. And in that, he discovered a new kind of intimacy, the kind that didn't burn out with intensity, but deepened over time with trust, with patience, with presence. Jacob had finally learned. Desire wasn't meant to own. It was meant to guide. And sometimes, the most powerful expression of love isn't in taking, but in holding space for someone to come closer on their own. The message came on a Wednesday morning. Jacob was sitting in a quiet cafe in Austin, editing photos on his laptop, when Mia's name lit up his screen. I got it. The text read, Paris, 1 year, I leave in 3 weeks. His breath caught, but his heart didn't collapse. Not this time. He stared at the message and felt a strange stillness. He knew how much this opportunity meant to her, the travel column, the independence, the story she'd always wanted to write. It had nothing to do with him, and yet everything to do with the version of her he'd come to love. Wild, curious, uncontainable. There was no panic, no internal scramble to make her choose, no instinct to negotiate the terms of their connection. Jacob simply felt a quiet ache and then a deeper kind of peace. Because Stoicism had taught him that love, when it's real, doesn't bind. It frees. They met that evening at their usual bench in Zilker Park, where the city lights shimmered behind the trees and the breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed earth. Mia's eyes were tired, searching, as if she expected him to pull away or worse, pretend to be okay. But he didn't do either. He reached for her hand and held it with a softness that said, I see you. I don't own you. I think you have to go, he said, not as resignation, but as reverence. Mia's lips parted, unsure. Are you really okay with this? Jacob nodded. I'd rather love someone I have to let go of than keep someone by shrinking their world. The words didn't come from a place of performance. They came from truth, from the man he had become, not someone who needed to be needed, but someone who could hold space for love without controlling it. That was the quiet revolution Stoicism had created in him. It wasn't just about emotional control. It was about understanding that love is not possession. It's participation without guarantees, without ultimatums, without fear. Over the next 3 weeks, they didn't rush to make memories. They didn't treat time like it was slipping through their fingers. They just lived meals on the balcony, walks in the park, quiet moments filled with glances and laughter that needed no translation. Jacob didn't count the days. He honored them. On the morning of her flight, they stood at the airport in a slow, unrushed goodbye. Mia leaned her forehead against his and whispered, I don't know what this will look like from there. Jacob smiled. We don't need to know. All we ever had was the moment and we used it well. He didn't cry until she was gone. Not because he held back, but because the tears came honestly, like rain that nourishes rather than floods. There was pain, yes, but there was no regret, no bitterness, only the quiet echo of love given freely. Weeks passed. Mia sent photos from Paris, little stories, pieces of her new world. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, and that, too, was okay. One weekend, Jacob drove out to Yosemite alone. It had been a place on his bucket list for years, but he'd always imagined going with someone else. Now, he realized he didn't need company to feel complete. Standing by the stillness of the lake, surrounded by ancient trees and towering cliffs, he thought of Mia not with longing, but with a strange joy. He closed his eyes and saw her smile, not something he needed to hold on to, but something he would always carry. In that moment, Jacob understood something that no relationship book had ever taught him, something no dating advice had ever come close to explaining, that real love isn't about being chosen, it's about choosing again and again, even when it means letting go. It's in the quiet acceptance that people change, that seasons shift, that good things don't need to last forever to have mattered. And as the wind rustled through the pines, he whispered a thank you to her, to himself, to the pain and the peace that had brought him here. He wasn't alone. He was whole. Jacob's story wasn't about finding the one. It wasn't about grand romantic gestures or perfect endings wrapped in cinematic kisses. It was about something far more honest, the quiet transformation of a man who stopped chasing love to be saved and started choosing love to be still at the beginning. Jacob was like many of us, drifting through modern dating with high hopes and heavy baggage. He wanted connection, yet clung to control. He mistook attention for affection and silence for rejection. When people pulled away, he panicked. When they got close, he tried too hard to hold on. His love was filled with fear, his heart constantly performing. But then came the breaking point, the moment that cracked the illusion wide open. And in that space, something ancient found its way in. Stoic philosophy. What began as a desperate search for answers turned into a quiet revolution within him. Jacob didn't become emotionally numb, he became emotionally aware. He stopped reacting and started responding. He learned that not every shift in someone's behavior was a reflection of his worth, that not all silences were indictments, that desire didn't have to morph into obsession, and that questions didn't have to lead to control. They could lead to connection. He learned how to observe without judging, how to listen without fixing, how to care without clinging. Through Mia, he was given the chance to practice everything he had been cultivating: patience, presence, emotional discipline. She wasn't a test, she was a mirror. She reflected back not just who he was falling for, but who he was becoming. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part. Jacob never tried to change her. He changed himself. He stopped needing certainty and learned to sit with mystery. He let go of his need to be everything for someone and became someone who could be steady when things felt uncertain. He loved her enough to let her go, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood what it meant to care with freedom. In the end, it wasn't about Mia staying or leaving. It wasn't about whether they ended up together or apart. It was about the version of himself Jacob uncovered along the way, the version that could love deeply, feel fully, and still stand whole, even when things fell away. He walked through fire and found peace on the other side. Not because he avoided pain, but because he embraced truth. He didn't win the girl, he won his integrity. And in a world where love often feels conditional, anxious, and transactional, that's the rarest kind of victory. So what's the lesson here? It's this: real love doesn't start with another person. It starts with self. When you stop chasing validation and start cultivating inner calm, everything changes. You begin to see others clearly, because you've finally seen yourself clearly. You stop playing games, because you're no longer afraid of loss. You listen better, love better, and suffer less, not because you figured people out, but because you figured yourself out. In today's dating world full of mixed signals, ghosting, and performance, Jacob's story is a reminder that we don't need more strategy. We need more stillness, more presence, more grounded curiosity. And here's how you can apply this. The next time someone pulls away, pause. Don't chase. Reflect. Ask yourself what you're actually feeling in your next conversation. Really listen, not to reply, but to receive. When you feel desire rising, check in with yourself. Is it love or fear in disguise? And above all, don't be afraid to let go of what isn't yours to hold. Because sometimes, loving someone means setting them free and loving yourself enough not to shrink, just to keep them. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of Jacob's journey resonated with you the most? Was it his shift from reaction to reflection? His ability to love without control? Or the moment he let go without bitterness? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights might help someone else see themselves in a new light too. And if this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about, something to feel, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps this space alive, and we're just getting started. There's more wisdom, more honesty, and more real stories ahead. Until next time, keep showing up, not for others to choose you, but to remember who you are.